This podcast is a proud member of the Edify Podcast Network. Listen to thousands of Christian podcasts at edify.app. That's EDIFI.app.
The Better Samaritan podcast, where we're learning how to love our neighbors well in a world filled with injustice and pain. Join me, Kent Annan, and Jamie Ayton, my co-host and colleague at the Humanitarian Disaster Institute at Wheaton College, as we interview experts with insight on learning to do good better.
Hi, my name is Kay Ashbrook. I'm a retired nurse practitioner, a mother of 2, and the proud grandmother of 4. My husband and I live along with our golden retriever and 3 cats near Richmond, Virginia. I love listening to Compelled. We live in a world that is broken and full of sorrow, pain, and regret. But these stories show the power of a loving Heavenly Father who delights to change lives that have been marked with hopelessness and despair into lives of purpose and profound joy. I hope that you enjoy listening to today's episode.
I went before a judge. I had multiple burglaries against me, but I was sentenced for 5 of them. I was sentenced to 5 99-year sentences. I was 19 years old.
I'm Paul Hastings, and you're listening to Season 4 of Compelled, a seasonal podcast using gripping, immersive storytelling to celebrate the powerful ways God is transforming the lives of Christians around the world. Last week, we heard from Garrett Kell, and for years, Garrett chased women, drugs, alcohol, and his own pleasures. But after being radically saved, he began serving the Lord as the pastor of a growing church. Yet Garrett carried a dark secret, an addiction to pornography. But as Garrett would discover, the same Jesus who came to save the sinner also came to deliver the saints. Again, you can hear that by tuning into last week's episode with Garrett Kell. Today is our season finale. That's right, this is the last episode of Season 4. But we have a very big announcement to make about the future of Compelled, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. So please listen through to the very end of this episode for that information. Today, our season finale guest is Ron Adkins. At the age of 19, Ron was sentenced to almost 500 years in prison. Ron was filled with rage, becoming a prison gang leader, and eventually became so violent he was locked up in solitary confinement and told he would stay there until he died. Condemned by society and separated from humanity, Ron knew that he was utterly alone. Or was he? Lean in and join us for the season finale in this compelling story from the kingdom of God. I met up with Ron 2 weeks ago just before Thanksgiving at his home church in Burnet, Texas. 2 things immediately struck my mind. First, I would never want to get in a tussle with Ron. He's tall, muscular, and built like a tank. In fact, his nickname in prison was Rhino. Second was Ron's humility and gentleness. It's hard to believe that a guy built like a rhinoceros could be so gentle or tender, but you'll even hear it in his voice. The Lord has given Ron a love for people, especially the broken. Ron has come a long way from where he first started, and his home life growing up in rural Texas was anything but gentle.
I grew up in a dysfunctional home. My mother and father, they didn't think they could have children at first. They were married for 12 years before I was born. And so my mother was told she would never have kids. But I was like a miracle baby. I was the answer to her prayers. And she's a very sweet Christian woman, and she was one of those people that you never heard a cuss word from, you know. Never touched any kind of drug or alcohol, and just never had an angry word, never met a stranger, that type of person, you know, just sweet as she could be. My father was a Korean War veteran, and he was just really angry, and he had a lot of animosity from the war and stuff that he brought with him, and maybe even some mental issues, you know. And because they had tried to adopt a child, and he had like a breakdown or something, and they took the child away from him.
Oh, wow.
So it was really tough. I guess I was just too much like him. We always butted heads ever since I was a little kid. And he was just real verbally and physically abusive, and just had a super bad rage problem. Even though my dad was the way he was, he still forced us basically to go to church because of my mom, I think. And so I knew about God, but I didn't know who God was. I just thought he was this big mean man, in an Abraham Lincoln chair with a list of everything I'd done wrong. He was like my dad. He was ready to beat me over the head every time I messed up. I think one time when I was like 10 years old, I went forward in a church service because I thought I was supposed to, and gave my heart to Jesus or whatever. But it was never just a real thing. It was just what I thought I was supposed to do type thing. When I got older, I started, thinking to myself, I'm going to get out of here as quick as possible. I'm going to get out on my own, get away from home, and do my own thing, And so that's what I did. I left and just started bumming around different people's places and got a job when I was 13 years old. And then that's where I got introduced to drugs and alcohol, working at this horse ranch when I was 13. It wasn't long after that I got in with a bad group of guys. We broke into a school in this little town where we were growing up near Greenville, Texas.
This is the school that you went to every day.
Yeah. We were at a basketball practice or something, and we broke into school, and we ended up. That's how I got my first felony when I was 14 years old. After that, I was on probation, and I basically didn't care anymore. The drugs and alcohol got worse. Criminal activity got worse. And finally, when I turned 17, I started going to jail for real. First, it was DWI, and then at some point there, I got involved in breaking in, burglarizing. Not only people's houses, but like drug houses, and stealing drugs and money out of drug houses and stuff. And in the mid-'90s, the state of Texas decided they were tired of dealing with me. I went before a judge. I thought the most I was going to get was 25 years. My lawyer basically told me that's what he thought, Oh, well, the worst they'll give you is 25 years, And I had multiple burglaries against me, but I was sentenced for 5 of them. I was sentenced to 5 99-year sentences. I was 19 years old.
Now, in case you didn't catch that, Ron just said that he was sentenced to 5 different sentences, each for 99 years. This was during the 1990s when Texas was going through an era known as tough on crime. There was very little leniency for criminal conduct, especially for repeat offenders. And unlike today, where oftentimes a prisoner will serve multiple sentences concurrently, these 5 sentences were to be served consecutively. Meaning once Ron finished his first 99-year sentence, he would then begin the next 99-year sentence until he had finished 495 consecutive years. He had effectively been sentenced to life in prison as a 19-year-old.
So what was going through your heart when, the judge read out the sentence?
I don't think it really sunk in until later on when I was back in my cell, at the jail or whatever, that, it's over. I'm going to be in prison the rest of my life. And I was just sort of like in shock. I was very angry and I was very bitter, and they sent me to the largest unit in the state of Texas. It's Compelled unit in Tennessee Colony, Texas, near Palestine. At the time, it was the most violent prison in the state. I learned real quick that I was going to have to make a reputation for myself if I was going to be safe. In prison, might makes right. And so the strongest, gets all the respect. And since I'm a large guy and I could be intimidating, I took on that persona. I took on which really isn't my personality. It really isn't my character to be, violent. But I just became violent. It wasn't long, I've been there about a year. The white gang started coming to me because, they look for the strongest to recruit. And so I eventually got in one of the most violent prison gangs in the state. I became a member of. It's called Aryan Circle. Basically, it's just a white guys' prison gang, but it's also, there's ideologies involved with white separatist, white supremacist type ideologies. At the time, Texas prisons were going through a lot of integration, and there was a lot of violence going on behind integrating the prisons because for so long it had been segregated. Blacks stayed with blacks, whites stayed with whites, Mexican stayed with Mexicans, and then very few mixing, right? In the early 90s, the federal government took over the prisons and integrated everything. And so these gangs all sprung up because of that. And so I became part of that gang, and the way you rise in the ranks of the gang is but through violence. The more stuff you do, the more work you put in, is what they call it, the higher up you rise in the ranks. And so I began to rise in the ranks, eventually to become a leader through several gang wars, riots, all kinds of different stabbings, all kinds of stuff happened. So yeah, you gotta do whatever they set you up to do, whether it's stabbing somebody or beating somebody up, or, thank God I never killed anybody, but it was just by the grace of God that didn't happen. And so I had a lot of guilt and shame behind that, because I knew in my heart I did those things just to benefit me. Not because I had to or even wanted to, but just because I knew it would benefit me reputation-wise and safety-wise. It's really based in fear. I know during all this time, God had his hand on my life, because there were times when guys were supposed to stab me on the rec yard, and they would go and give the knife to the officers and turn themselves in instead of doing it.
Oh, wow.
Or a riot would break out in a day room I was in, and people would be getting killed all around me, and nothing would happen to me. It was like a bubble would be around me or something. Barely come out of there with even a cut or whatever. Looking back at it now, I know that it was God's hand on my life protecting me. I believe that with all my heart. He was guiding me through all those years of prison. I used to persecute Christians or try to talk them out of being Christians especially when I was really feeding into my rage and anger issues, and I really didn't believe there was a God. I was real good at putting the atheist argument up there, telling them it was just a crutch, and they just had jailhouse Christianity, and they needed something to make them feel good or whatever. But that was me.
Within just a handful of years, Ron had made a name for himself as incredibly angry and violent. That's when the other prisoners nicknamed him Rhino, and the prison administrators and guards treated him accordingly.
In 2000, I had several assault cases and I'd also fought with the officers a lot when I was in prison, because I rebelled against authority all the time. And so they were tired of dealing with me again. And they declared me a security threat to the institution and staff, and I was placed in solitary confinement. And I spent the next 13 years in a 5x8 cell by myself.
Wow.
Administrative segregation is what they call it. You don't really interact. Only people you really interact with is the other officers that take you out of your cell. You're handcuffed behind your back, and 2 officers escort you with clubs and shields to wherever you have to go. Like if you have to go to the infirmary, or if they take you out for recreation, sometimes you get an hour recreation a day, but it's just going from a little cage to a big cage, basically. You have no other interaction with other people unless it's just, screaming and hollering out through the vent in the back of your cell or something to the next guy in the next cell, Once I got back there, my behavior got even worse, because my real problem was I hated myself. I had a self-destructive mindset, and I put myself in all these violent situations because I really wanted to die. I didn't want to do all this time. I didn't want to spend my life in prison, but I felt like I couldn't commit suicide, but I was really suicidal. I was always putting myself in these dangerous positions, like really hoping something would happen. And so when I got in solitary confinement, it was just me in there. And I had no other distractions. And so for the first 5 years that I was back there, I was on the super high security, lowest you can go, level 3 ADSEG is what they call it. It's the bottom of the barrel in the prison. There's criminally insane there. There's everybody all the rejects. It's like the lowest section of the solitary section, right? They got level 1, 2, and 3, and 3 is the lowest.
Wow.
You're restricted of everything. You basically have no personal property and basically disciplinary type area. But my violence only got worse. Like I used to, whenever they would take you out for a shower, they would take you out of your cell and handcuff you. I used to break out of the handcuffs and assault the officers. Had over 30 staff assaults. I would just attack anybody at any time without warning. It was just like a mindset that I was in. It was like a rage mindset, like I was at war with these officers because, I mean, there are several times where they beat me up real bad, busted my face open, slammed my head into the brick walls, all kinds of crazy stuff that happened to me. They were just trying to subdue me, but I took it like personal vendetta against them. And so that's the way I lived my life for 5 years, in this personal vendetta against these officers.
Ron was in a continuous cycle of rage, but he felt it was justified. Sure, he had committed some burglaries, but nothing that deserved 500 years in prison. And that made him bitter, which made him angry. And with a 5-century-long prison sentence, there was no end in sight to the vicious cycle of anger.
In 2005, my dad passed away. I didn't really expect it to affect me the way it did, but it really affected me. It was almost like a wake-up call. Like maybe the Lord was just using it to wake me up out of this rageaholic stupor I was in, you know? And I got to thinking about my mom being out there by herself, and I was worried about what was going to happen to her as well. So the prison had a library where you could check books out. Man, I started just reading everything I could about psychology and philosophy, and I taught myself how to write poetry and iambic pentameter, and
Wow.
I taught myself about chess, and I started playing correspondence chess with people all over the world. All this stuff to keep my mind occupied and to try to teach myself how to come out of this place of aggression and violence, and to manage my emotions, you know, in a worldly way. Because by this time, I didn't believe there was a God. I basically thought, you know, it's just us and there is no God. And I was off into, like, I started studying about pagan religions and Buddhism and Hinduism and all the different religions you can think of. I studied them, just trying to find some kind of switch to turn my anger off. So things went on like that for a while, but because of my past behavior, I was still like on a blacklist, you know, so from time to time, the officers would still come and try to, you know, take retribution on me, try to fire me up, and seemed like it to me. They were trying to fire me up and get me to do something stupid. And usually it worked. And so I got in more trouble and more trouble and more trouble. Finally, in 2009, they transferred me to a supermax prison up in Texarkana. It's a different kind of segregation where you're way more isolated. Everywhere you go, there's like 3 or 4 officers escorting you, and you're chained hand and foot just to go to the shower or whatever. It's just like way more supermax is what they call it. When I got there, I immediately got indicted for a crime that I committed when I was on the Compelled unit that had happened like 2 or 3 years before that. It was for having a cell phone, which is called a prohibited item in a penal institution. And so I went back to court, and they told me, well, we're filing a habitual criminal because of all the felonies you've had, and we're going to try to give you another life sentence.
On top of the
599s.
This blow was too much. Ron already knew that he didn't have a chance of getting out of prison, but to be told that he would be given yet another 99-year sentence was crushing. He couldn't muster the courage to commit suicide, but already, on the inside, he felt like he was dying. But unknown to him, hope was just around the corner. More on that after the break.
Stay in God's Word each day with the Bar Podcast Network shows that can be delivered daily to your smartphone. Get shows like Just Thinking, Thankful Homemakers, The Antithesis, and over 10 other podcasts across the Bar Network. Whether it's a daily devotional, biblical hermeneutics, or expository preaching, the Bar Podcast will keep you immersed in Scripture between Sundays. Subscribe to your next favorite Christian podcast today at thebarpodcast.com.
This episode is brought to you by the Better Samaritan podcast with hosts Ken Annan and Jamie Aden.
The whole idea is we're looking at how do we do good better. The Good Samaritan helped out along the road, but then in Dr. Martin Luther King's sermon, he talked about how we want to also figure out why did the person get beat up along the road. So we want to make the whole road safer. So that's where we're coming from on this podcast.
Far too often we've seen Good Samaritans whose hearts were in the right place, but because they weren't also helping with their smarts, they actually ended up causing harm. So we really want to bring both our faith and look for biblical understanding, as well as what can research and science teach us to be able to help us do this work better. Most often, it's these small acts of kindness that make the biggest differences in the lives of our neighbors. And so on the podcast, we explore those small ways to get involved, those tangible, practical, concrete ways of what it means to love our neighbors.
You can find Better Samaritan anywhere you get podcasts.
Welcome back to Compelled. We've been listening to Ron Adkins share about his story of being sentenced to 500 years in prison as a 19-year-old. He joined a prison gang and became a violent prisoner, racking up hundreds of violations. He became so out of control that he was moved to solitary confinement and had been living alone in a 5x8 cell for the last 9 years. But now, Ron had been charged with another violation, which this time the authorities wanted to sentence him to an additional 99 years, effectively another lifetime sentence. For Ron, this was a death blow. Whatever meager hope he held onto for being released had vanished. He felt utterly broken, utterly worthless, and utterly alone. But he was about to discover that he wasn't.
Well, I was in my cell alone. I guess the best way for me to describe it is it was like Jesus came in the cell with me, because the presence and power of God came in the cell. Like I didn't see him in person or visually, but I could just feel the presence of God in the cell. And I just began to weep. I hadn't even cried, 15 years maybe, because, I always had that stone face, tough guy persona on,
But you didn't even believe in God at this point.
No. But I knew it was him. It was just overwhelming. I had an old Bible that I kept all the time. In prison, you had to have something you keep your addresses and stuff in. And most people just have a Bible because it's the only thing they can't take from you. And I had all my addresses written in it. And all the Old Testament was gone because I've been using it for rolling papers.
Rolling papers?
Yeah, I've been smoking the Bible.
You'd been ripping out pages.
Yeah, and using them for rolling papers, yeah. Because in prison, tobacco's illegal. They made it illegal, So, but it still gets in there. And the best rolling papers they have are 10 pages out of the Bible. Yeah, I done ripped the whole Old Testament out of it, smoking it. That's how much I cared about God, When I had that encounter with the Lord, I prayed. I said, God, I don't even believe you're real. I don't even think I can have faith. I've taught myself all this philosophy and psychology that says there is no God. I read Nietzsche and Friedrich Hegel and all these philosophers, I said, if you're real, you're going to have to show me. And immediately it was like just hot oil poured all over my body. And it was like I was just being baptized in love. And I took that old Bible and I began to read it. And and the New Testament is all that's left in it. I began to read about how he set me free, how he came to die. And, he spoke to me and said, if it had just been you, I would have done it just for you. I would have came and died just for you. That's how much you mean to me. That's how valuable you are to me. Right? He's always coming and just showing me that he was there, that he was, or he would take me back to events in my life. Hey, you remember when that that guy was going to stab you and he gave the knife to the officer instead of stabbing you. That was me. Just all these things that he showed me that. But the main way was from his word. He just made it come to life like it never had before. The book of John probably the most, in Romans too, but for sure the book of John, just especially chapters 13 through 17. Yeah, where it starts with him washing the disciples' feet all the way to the prayer that he prayed, for us. That's what he did for me. That's how I know it's true, because from the day I had that encounter with the Lord, I never over 250 major disciplinary infractions in prison. 0 good time, 0 everything for years, over 12 years. 30 staff assaults, some with bodily injury. And from the day I had that encounter, it was never another one.
Wow.
Because my identity changed. I didn't have to work on the behavior. My identity changed. From that day on, I never got another disciplinary case in prison. From that encounter with the Lord in 2009, from that day forward, there was never any more rage problem. It was like peace just settled on me. And I was able to, and since I was at a different unit from where most of my trouble occurred, the officers didn't really know me. So I was able to just sort of fade into the background and just be, like everybody else.
Ron was a transformed man, but he still had to deal with the consequences of his previous decisions, specifically the violation for smuggling in a cell phone. So he struck a plea bargain deal, and instead of receiving another 99-year sentence, he received 5 more years, which now brought his total sentence to an official 500 years, because as you'll recall, his first 5 sentences were 99 years each. And while Ron's faith was now growing, he was still in solitary confinement, and he hoped to at least be transferred back to the general population. So he made that request.
During that time, I had, quit the gang. I was put all that gang stuff behind me, and I was trying to get into a program called the GRAD program that Texas offers, called Gang Renouncement and Disassociation Program. And it's basically to be declared an ex-gang member by the state, I had been praying one day, and I was telling the Lord, if this is going to be my life, I'll spend the rest of my life in this prison serving you. As long as I have you, I'm good with it. Because for so long, I had fought against that, and I had taken on that time as my identity. Like I would tell them officers, man, I got 5 life sentences. You can't tell me nothing. I'll do whatever I want to do. All you can do is send me to death row, and I really don't care if you do that or not. And so I basically had taken it on as my identity. And God began to deal with me and said, you got to surrender that to me. You got to surrender that. You got to surrender your reputation. Because my prison nickname was Rhino. That was Big Rhino. That was my name, That was my reputation. Everybody knew, don't mess with him. He's violent, And so he'll hurt you. And so the Lord just really began to deal with me about surrendering all of that to him.
But despite surrendering his reputation over to the Lord, Ron's application for the Gang Renouncement and Disassociation Program was turned down. He was still sitting in the highest security level of solitary confinement in a supermax prison. The state of Texas still saw Ron as a confirmed gang member and wouldn't allow him to attend the only program that would let him renounce his gang membership in the state's eyes. And Ron also had that brand new 5-year sentence. He might end up spending the rest of his life alone in a 5x8 cell until he died. So Ron made the most of it. For the next 3 years, Ron kept reading his Bible and borrowed whatever theology books he could request from the prison library. Then, in 2012, something unusual happened.
I was sitting there in my cell one day, and the officer came to my door, and he said, come on, get dressed. Adkins, you got a parole interview, right? Well, I knew I wasn't even eligible for parole until 2095. That's 80 years from then.
Wow.
And so I was like, nah, you got the wrong dude. That ain't me. I ain't up for no parole. He said, oh, yeah. He asked me my number. I told him 803789. He said, yeah, that's you. Come on. So I went, got dressed. I figured it was a mistake. You know, a lot of times they make mistakes. They call out the wrong person, whatever. So I go down there, and the guy interviews me, and I'm basically just joking my way through it, being sarcastic and stuff, because I don't think it's real.
You're just joking your way through your parole interview.
Parole interview, yeah. The guy says, all right, we'll contact you with an answer later on. I'll say, oh, okay, whatever. So I go back to my cell, and I forgot about it. Because, I mean, that happens sometimes. They call the wrong person out for a visit, or they call the wrong person for an interview because just get names mixed up. It happens. And so I didn't think nothing about it. About 2 months later, I get a letter in the mail, and I open it up, and it says, you made parole on all 5 99-year sentences. At one time, had them listed out.
No way.
Yeah. And I was just blown away. I was like, what? This was in May of 2012.
Because you're not supposed to get out till 2095.
Yeah, I wasn't even eligible till 2095.
So what happened? How did that happen, man?
Nobody knows for sure. The best I could figure, in 2007, they came up with some kind of law about consecutive sentences where all the sentences in a line, only the last sentence in line is active or something like that. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but what it did was it made me make parole on all 5 of those sentences and start the 5-year sentence that I had gotten in prison. I guess the truth of it is, for many years, I did live in hopelessness because I knew I wasn't getting out.
And you didn't even pray that? It just didn't really cross your mind?
No. I didn't dare to hope for it. So actually the 5-year sentence triggered all that. The new sentence actually triggered it all. But really it was just God.
As you can imagine, Ron was ecstatic. The impossible had just happened. After entering prison as a teenager and spending over half of his entire life incarcerated and believing he was going to die there, Ron was going to be set free. But he still had one more sentence, the 5-year sentence, which triggered the review, and the parole board declined to grant him parole for that new infraction, which meant that Ron would still need to serve out the remaining time, which was about 3 more years. But Ron knew that if God could miraculously spare him from the rest of a 500-year sentence, but wanted him to stay in prison for another 3 years, then there must be a reason.
Even though I've had this relationship with the Lord and I had been with him for these 3 years, I still didn't know who he was, really. I still saw him as that legalistic, mean, gray bearded man in the Abraham Lincoln chair, you know what I mean? Ready to beat me over the head every time I did something wrong. And that's not who the Father is.
Yeah.
A few months later, I had been, like I told you, I had been signed up for this grad program, but they would never let me go because of my assaultive history. They said, no, you're never getting out of solitary confinement. You're going to be in solitary confinement till they let you out of here. And so 8 months later, they told me I was on the chain, which is a transfer bus, basically, what they call it, the chain bus. And they said, you're being transferred to Ellis Unit to the grad program. So I went to the program, and it's basically like a 9-month program, and they transition you. The first 3 weeks, you're still in solitary confinement, but then the next 3 weeks, you get a cellie. You know, somebody to live in the cell with you.
So cellmate.
Yeah. And then the next 3 weeks after that, you transition into more of a general population type area. It's still kind of controlled, but it's more general population type where you go to the chow hall to eat and you go to the day room for a little while each day. And so they transition you. When you go to these classes too, like cognitive intervention, anger management, all these kind of secular classes, but God was using those to teach me, especially cognitive intervention. And God used that secular class to really help me understand where my behavior was coming from. All these thinking that I had lived with for these 25 years had to be addressed and changed. And God used those classes to point them out to me, you know, so I could change that way of thinking. And without that, I wouldn't have never made it out. I would have never made it through that program. And so finally, I finished the program, and my mom got to come visit me, and I got to hug her for the first time in 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was just a real emotional, awesome moment.
After having been absent from the general prison population for 13 years, many of the inmates were surprised to see Ron again, but they were even more shocked to learn that he was now a Christian.
I guess the best way to describe it was they were just like really not believing. Like I was just playing a game. Like I was just doing that to get through the program, and because that's what a lot of guys do. They want to get out of SIG, so they say they're out of the gang and they go through the program, and But with me, it's a little bit different because I had all this. A lot of them knew me from fighting with officers a lot. I had all this history of this violent behavior, and they were just like unbelief. It actually caused several of them, to find the Lord, just because of the transition in my life from what I was before to what I am now. Several times I've had that happen. They'd be like, "Man, what happened? Tell me about it." And I would get to share my testimony about encountering the Lord, and they'd be like, "Wow, man," I'd be able to pray with them, and they would find the Lord through it. But God wasn't finished there. He sent me from there to the WIN unit in Huntsville, Texas. And when I got there, one of my friends, they had started what they call the School of Transformation. And it's basically like a Bible study type class. But this guy named Charlie and his wife Judy were coming in and teaching it there in the prison. And so when I got there, they were just graduating their first group of leaders, and they were fixing to take like 60 inmates in the class. So I got to get in it. That's when I really started learning about inner healing, these places in your heart that are still broken, that God wants to come in and heal if you'll just let him. And so we started having these groups, like 8-man groups within the classes, and we just started doing this inner healing ministry where we would just ask Holy Spirit to come and just really reveal to us what it was that was triggering us, and where the guilt and the shame that we were still carrying was, and also God to reveal to us who he really is, and show us who we are and the way he sees us. And through that, I began to learn who my Father really is. I began to learn that he's a loving Father, and that he cares about everything in our life, and that we're valuable to him, more valuable than we could ever know. And I never understood that before. I never thought I was valuable to anybody. I always thought I was just a mistake, or I would never amount to nothing. I was always going to be a convict. I was always going to just be a number in the state system, Through these classes and these interactions with these other guys, and through Charlie modeling the love of the Father to all of us, I was able to come to a whole nother realization about who God is.
Wow.
It changed my whole life. I don't think I'd be sitting here talking to you today without that class and that type of understanding of the Lord. And so I spent about 3 more years there. But it was May 5th, 2015, and I was released from prison. I wasn't really sure it was actually going to happen. Like a lot of times you get right to the door and they say, "Oh, no, we're taking it back. We're not going to let you go right now." But I knew, I could finish that whole 5-year sentence and they would let me go. But I was always worried about the parole on the 599s too. Like if I did something wrong, I might mess that up.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, I didn't really believe it till I walked out the gate. And my mom and my brother came and picked me up, and it was just wild. I mean, it was like waking up from a dream, because when I went to prison, there was no internet, there was no smartphones, there was no debit cards at the gas pump.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I went to prison in the mid-90s and I got out in 2015.
For the first time in 24 years, Ron Adkins was a free man. He entered prison as a 19-year-old, bitter, violent, and filled with rage, but he left as a transformed creation. But what happened next was beyond anything he could have imagined. which you'll hear about right after the break. After 24 years in prison, Ron Adkins was miraculously released on life parole. The transition back to the free world was overwhelming at times, but Ron slowly fell back into a rhythm. Ron eventually got a job welding and running construction equipment, and he also got the chance to share his testimony with various church groups and ministries, which is how he met his wife today, Dawn, who also spent a lot of time in prison, but who was powerfully saved by the Lord and has her own compelling testimony of redemption. Ron and Dawn were married on December 24th of 2016, and they moved back to where Ron grew up in rural Texas. They were settling into their new life with each other when God opened yet another unexpected door.
We were going to this little country church where I grew up. We were in there one day. This is about 3 weeks after we were married. And the pastor introduced me to this man. His name's Robert Newsom. And I was like, immediately it just struck me. It was like, man, I know that name from somewhere. It kept bothering me. Who is this guy? But that evening, it finally dawned on me, that's the name of the judge who sentenced me to 5 99-year sentences. And he's actually a pastor. And he had this little group of guys that were meeting in his living room. And they called the ministry In One Accord. It was from all different churches, but they were meeting for prayer meetings in his living room. Well, he was coming back to that little church to preach a message on Sunday. And me and Don were there. And when the message was over, we went up to him and he looked up at me. He's a little short guy, And he looked up at me and was like, "Are we okay?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I gave him this big hug, because God had already healed me in all those places of forgiveness, through inner healing, through counseling with our pastors in Florida and different things. He had already brought me into healing through everything that happened in the trial. And he was like, the judge was like, that day, he said, "Man, why don't you and Don come to my house for these prayer meetings?" So we started going in his living room every Tuesday and Sunday night and having these prayer meetings. And it was just like a bunch of people, other people that he had put in prison actually were there too.
Wow.
And so we would just meet. There was like 20 or 25 of us in his living room just sitting on the floor worshiping the Lord and praying. And all of a sudden, all this stuff started happening. Like the city officials from the jail where I was sentenced at, they wanted to meet with us, and we went in front of them, and they heard Don's testimony, they heard my testimony, and the sheriff was immediately like, "When can you come in my jail?" So we started going into jail, ministering to the girls and the guys both in the jail, and God just started bringing revival in the jail, and people started getting saved and set free. And then the meeting that was in the judge's living room went from 20, 25 people to 400 people. And they had to rent the Civic Center, which is the biggest building in the county, in order to have the services in it. And then they started, the jail administrator, he's a Christian guy too. He was so affected by it, he started busing the inmates over to the services, which they're still doing right now today. And in their striped uniforms, they come into the church services and have church with us on Tuesday and Sunday nights. So God just really just birthed the whole revival type movement in that city just behind me and the judge's relationship.
Ron can tell you so many stories about how God has been redeeming his time in prison and has been using Ron's testimony to touch lives and point others to the Lord. One of those times was at a marriage conference just a few years ago that Ron and Don led at the original prison, where Ron had been so violent and become a gang leader and eventually had been placed into solitary confinement.
So there was an officer, when I gave my testimony during that marriage conference, there was an officer sitting at the back of the room, which usually they have an officer in the services, in case anything happens, they have one there. And this was Mr. Jacobs. He was an old African-American man that been there at that prison for years and years. And back when I was there, he was on what they call the SORT team, which is the team that they send in there and they put riot gear on. Whenever you're acting up, they send them in there to restrain you, right? And there's 6 guys in full riot gear. They spray you with tear gas and tackle you down, handcuff you, and drag you off. Sometimes they beat you up, whatever they do. But when I used to be back there causing all that trouble, he was one of the ones that would come to subdue me because he's a big guy. And he was in the service that day. And after I gave my testimony, he came up to me after it was over, after the service was over, and he was just crying, tears just coming down his cheeks. And he said, "Man, if I never knew there was a God before, I know there's one now. Because I can't believe you're standing here telling this story." Because he remembered, all them times they had to come in the cell and extract me from the cell and hog tie me and carry me off, Yeah, it was a good story, man. He was overwhelmed by it. So was I, too.
As our interview came to an end, I asked Ron, what would he tell our listeners with a loved one in prison right now?
I would say don't give up. Keep praying. Keep talking to them about the Lord. Just keep loving them and letting them know that God loves them and that they're valuable to him, and not to ever give up. I wouldn't be here now if my mother hadn't prayed all them years. Prayer is powerful, and God hears every one of them, whether you see the results of it or not. And he's always working in your loved one's life. He's always working. I mean, if it's your son or your daughter, or your grandson, granddaughter, God cares about that. He cares about your prayers, and he cares about that person, and they're valuable to him.
Well, Ron, I appreciate you sharing your story with me, man. It is something that I just find incredible to listen to. Just like the way that you can see clearly how God preserved you in prison and is now using you to touch other people's lives.
It's awesome.
All right, man.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
When Ron was first sentenced as a 19-year-old for half a millennium, he knew that there would be no getting out and that all hope was lost. But it took almost 20 years of being locked up and a decade of solitary confinement before Ron would finally open up his heart to the Lord. And what a transformation it made. From a violent gang leader to a prison evangelist. It's so encouraging to see how God has used Ron's darkest moments and redeemed those to now touch and change the lives of countless others. Today, Ron and his wife operate Radical Restoration Ministries, which is a year-round Christian discipleship program for broken women recovering from addiction, abuse, or incarceration, with homes in Florida, Indiana, and Texas. If you'd like to learn more about the Adkins or become involved in their ministry, then visit their website, radicalrestorationministries.com, or visit compelledpodcast.com and pull up the show notes for this episode, where we'll include some additional photos of Ron, including while he was in prison. Now, at the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that this story is our final episode of the season, which of course may leave you wondering, when will our next season come out? Now, if you've been a long-time listener of Compelled, then you probably know that we take very lengthy breaks in between seasons. And that's because everyone who makes Compelled has a full-time job apart from this podcast. We've been making the show for the last 4 years in our spare time and as funding comes in. Well, each season costs around $12,000 to create, which is no small amount, but also nothing too large that God can't provide. And now we've got a very important announcement about the future of our show, though, which we'll be making during a live video hangout a week from now on Wednesday night on December 15th at 8:30 p.m. Central Time. And all of you are invited to hang out with us. You'll meet our entire team, including myself, my wife, and our editors, and of course, you'll meet other Compelled listeners. And who knows, maybe some of our previous Compelled guests will pop in too. This will be your opportunity to ask questions, learn about our production process, talk about this season, and all kinds of other things. But most importantly, this is where you'll hear our very big announcement. To sign up for that call and get the private video hangout link, visit compelledpodcast.com/announcement. So put it on your calendars 1 week from now on Wednesday night, December 15th at 8:30 p.m. Central Time. And again, that link to sign up for the call is compelledpodcast.com/announcement. This episode was edited by Zach Fowler and Will Jackson. Our media assistant is Ethan Adams, and our associate producer is Sarah Hastings. I'm your host, Paul Hastings, and you've been listening to Compelled. I hope to see all of you next Wednesday on our video call when we make our very big announcement. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. See you then.
the Better Samaritan podcast, where we're learning how to love our neighbors well in a world filled with injustice and pain. Join me, Kent Annan, and Jamie Ayton, my co-host and colleague at the Humanitarian Disaster Institute at Wheaton College, as we interview experts with insight on learning to do good better.